Good morning.
Morning.
I was meant to preach from PowerPoint. Unfortunately, the HDMI cable cannot be found. Just for avoidance of doubt, it's that cable which connects the projector to the laptop. Hilside owns a projector, they own an HDMI, and I don't know what happened. The last time I think that person used the HDMI, it's misplaced somewhere. So I thought he had brought it. I would have brought mine, because last time I used my personal one, but I thought that one had been found. But nevertheless, it's still not there, so Pavel promised me that he's going to replace it. So I will find a replacement to that lesson. That lesson will come some other day in the future. I'm glad, of course, as the young man was saying, to also be back from that long sojourn in the Philippines. It's actually called the Philippines, not the Philippines. So, yes, we had a very good and wonderful trip. Perhaps, Lord willing, time permitting, I might share with you in future some of the highlights of the trip. It was a marvelous trip, especially for them. I think they enjoyed some things. This is my fourth time going to that country. It has almost become a second home to me because of the love and affection of the brethren in the Philippines. They are wonderful. They are really wonderful. We'll talk more about that in the future. So our reading this morning was taken from John chapter 4. Of course, it's not up the board. I'm going to take the reading again, but as I'm going through this reading, I want you to be listening to what I would call the rhythmic word that continues to come back again in these three verses that we are going to read. There is a word that has become the rhythm of that passage, because my lesson this morning is actually centered on that word. So, this is Jesus who was talking to the woman that he found at the well in Samaria. And in verse 22, he said to this woman, "You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." Before we go further, if you actually think about that statement, you worship what we don't know, but we worship what we know. Already Jesus is making a distinction between the worship. At least in that passage, he has already brought out two kinds of worship that are actually happening. One, obviously, being the worship of God, and the other can only be the worship of idols. So he then went further and he said, "We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." Verse 23. "But the hour is coming and is now here, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." At least 7 times in these 3 verses, the word worship comes, it keeps on repeating itself. I want to talk about worship this morning, and of course highlighting the fact that not every kind of worship is accepted to God. So in the book of Matthew chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, we know that discourse from Jesus as the Sermon on the Mount. In verse 1 of chapter 5, the Bible actually tells us that Jesus, who had spent the night in the mountain, he came back in the morning, and of course he gathered his disciples. He called them to him. Many disciples, we don't know how many thousands they were, or maybe hundreds, or maybe tens, we don't know. But what we know is when he called them, he then started teaching them. But of course, out of those disciples, many of them, he actually is going to choose some that he then called apostles. So he sat down and his disciples came to him. How many disciples we are not told, but disciples were many. It was actually a big number, and of course it comprised both women and men. They were actually his disciples. Let's differentiate the two. disciples were many, apostles were 12. But apostles were also disciples in a way. So disciples were many because disciples were those that were learning or following Jesus. Disciple means a learner. So they were learning from him. So he taught them several practical lessons contained in Matthew 5, in Matthew chapter 6, in Matthew chapter 7. In fact, if you are going to count the lessons that he taught them individually, you come up with not less than 20 practical lessons that he actually taught them. And he taught them to learn because he wanted to apply some of those things in their lives. We too, today, are still learning a lot from them. And we, of course, are expected to also apply them in our lives. But what is actually striking is in chapter 7, as Jesus was going to conclude his discourse, there is something that he is going to say in chapter 7, verse 21, 22, 23, a very common passage to many of us. But I love this passage because to me, there is a message that this passage keeps, knocking, keeps ascending to all of us. And he said, Jesus, in verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. In verse 22, on that day, men will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. A question definitely is going to arise. And perhaps we may also want to ask exactly the same question and say, if someone has been worshiping God, if someone has dedicated his time in his life to worship God, how is it possible that Jesus is going to say to him, I never knew you. In fact, get away from me. You were, in fact, he says, depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. How is that possible? How can this ever happen? How can Jesus say, I never knew you, when I spent and dedicated all my time worshiping him? And I think the answer is found in exactly the passage that we read earlier from the book of John chapter 4. And perhaps we may need to reread that again as part of what I'm talking about now. In verse 22, Jesus said to the woman of Samaria that he met at the well, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know. For salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. In verse 24, he says, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. Of course, in this verse that we are reading, in this passage that we are just reading now, verse 22 in particular, Jesus actually shows us, he showed the woman then, he showed his disciples, he's showing us also as his disciples today, he shows that there are people who may spend time worshiping, but worshiping what they don't know. And I think that's a very sad scenario, of course, because Jesus made an acknowledgement on the day to this woman of Samaria that you are worshiping, spending time worshiping, but you worship something that you don't know. And this we actually see that manifesting itself even in our lives today. We actually see in our communities and everywhere across the globe today, we see people who are worshiping, but in truth, they are worshiping what they don't know. And that's exactly what Jesus was talking about here. In verse 24, he actually says that worshiping God should be in spirit and in truth. It should not be from our emotions or our own personal desires. And again, this is exactly what we see happening or panning out everywhere, particularly in the denominations today. We actually see people who are so sincere, who want to worship God. Unfortunately, they are worshiping God in their own emotions. And many of them are actually worshiping God according to their own personal desires. In Acts chapter 16, verse 14, there is an interesting woman that we are told about there. The verse describes this woman who was called Lydia. You remember in Acts chapter 16, Paul has just gone into Philippi. While he is in Philippi, they are going to meet this woman who herself was a foreigner. She, of course, was a native or an indigenous from Thyatira. but she had gone to do some business in Philippi. So Paul is going to meet this woman together with his entourage, and they are going to teach them. The verse, actually, verse 14 of chapter 16 describes Lydia as a worshipper of God. She worshipped God. The following verse, verse 15, tells us that she, together with her household, were baptized. And again, the question is, if she was already a worshipper of God, so why was she baptized? How could Paul go and baptize people who are already worshiping God? And again, the answer is very clear, that they were worshiping God according to the way that was now archaic, according to the way that was ancient, according to a way that was going on. They were supposed to be worshiping God according to a new way, which they did not know at the time. So they needed to change. Because of their way of worship, it was no longer acceptable, even though it was formally acceptable. So she had to change and conform to the new way of worship. God has a prerogative. You and me perhaps agree this morning that he has a prerogative to change the way he wants to be worshipped without sounding a siren, without making any consultation, without anyone's approval. He doesn't need anyone's approval. Beginning from the time of Adam, God has always been worshipped. And Adam, together with the fathers who followed him right up to the time we got to Moses, those people were worshiping God in a way that God wanted them to worship him at the time. But when he changed for some group of people, in this particular case the Jews or the Israelites, he changed and he gave them a documented law which they were supposed to follow to the letter. Those are the children of Israel. Again, he didn't need to consult anybody. He just told them that this is what he was going to do. Later on, when we come to the New Testament, we actually see the prerogative of God again coming to play. God is changing the worship. The way they were worshiping God, that is the Jews, is not the same way we are worshiping God today. So God still is sovereign, and he still maintains that he is the one who should choose and tell us how we should worship. Once he changes, it is incumbent upon you and me, incumbent upon each person, of course, to follow the new way. Because then we are not going to have an excuse and say we didn't know, because we are expected to know the way God is worshipped. Saul of Tarsus is another very good example, who of course later became Apostle Paul. We know about him. He was a worshipper of God. In fact, when he describes himself, he actually says, I am a Jew who was born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers. Being zealous for God, as all of you are this day, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem and to be punished. He was a worshipper of God. Saul was a worshipper of God, we have no doubt about it, who worshipped according to the law of Moses, which was acceptable at the time, but this law of Moses had actually been thrown out of the window. God had changed it because he wanted it to change. So Paul, whether he liked it or not, he also was supposed to conform to the new law. Jews had worshipped God for a very, very long time, according to the law of Moses. I mean, for at least 1,500 years, perhaps, they had worshipped God according to the law, according to this law that was written down by Moses, according to the 10 commandments that Moses had written down, recorded in Exodus chapter 20. They knew this is the way God is supposed to be worshipped. When we come into the New Testament, in the book of Acts in particular, we are going to see that the conflict that is going to rise between people who had become Christians and the Jews is because the Jews were still thinking that we are the people of God. In fact, the reason why Paul would write the book of Galatians, he was writing that to actually contend with these people who were teaching that Judaism was still in force. So many of them would actually tell you that if you want to worship God, even though some of them half-heartedly were accepting that there is a way, a new way, they still believed that you needed to be you needed to be circumcised according to the law of Moses. If you read the book of Acts, chapter 15, it actually contains an account of elders and apostles who had a conference, a meeting in Jerusalem. One of the reasons why they had the meeting was to discuss this Judaism, which some of them were continuously perpetuating. In fact, they are going to end up writing a letter which was given to Paul and several other people that he was traveling with, Silas being one of them, to go and show the brethren that they no longer needed to be circumcised for them to become Christians. Jews maintained that they were worshippers of God, yet the law of God had changed. Any Jew who worshipped otherwise from the law of Moses, according to them, he deserved to die, because according to them, he was doctoring the law of God according to the law of Moses. He would be considered to be blaspheming or to be committing idolatry. And of course, the punishment for blaspheming was death. He would die by being stoned. Stephen is going to die in Acts chapter 7 because he was deemed to have blasphemed God, because he was talking about a Jesus who was foreign to them, according to them. Saul was on his way to Damascus to arrest such people and bring them down to Jerusalem to be punished. But we know that on his way to Damascus, Jesus asked him a question and said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? In fact, this is a very sweet question that Paul is going to be asking in Acts chapter 9. As he is approaching Damascus, for the sole reason of arresting Christians to bring them down to Jerusalem to be persecuted, Jesus meets him on the way. I consider Saul to be very blessed because if God wanted, he could have just struck him dead. But instead, he was given a second opportunity to change his mind from the way he was worshipping. At that point, we know that Saul, who already was a worshiper of God, but he was worshipping God in a way that was no longer acceptable, he had to change, and he was baptized. According to Acts chapter 9, verse 18, we know that after Ananias came to him and talked to him, he was asked a question. He tells us that he was asked a question when he narrates his story later in Acts chapter 22 and in Acts chapter 26 as well. He actually said, I was asked a question, Brother Paul, why are you still waiting? Stand up and be baptized. Of course, he stood up and he was baptized. He began to worship God in the acceptable way, according to Acts chapter 9, verse 20. It actually says, and immediately he proclaimed Jesus in the synagogues, saying, he is the Son of God. In Acts chapter 19, reading from verse 1 to 5, it actually gives us another good example of people who worship God in an inspired way. You may remember those men that Paul met in Ephesus. When he went in there, he found 12 men who professed to be worshippers of God. Paul said to them, do you know anything about the Holy Spirit? And of course, they didn't know anything. And then he said to them, what kind of baptism did you receive? And of course, they said they had received John's baptism. And of course, you remember that. And then he actually you may remember that Paul ended up baptizing those people to then put them into the new way that was supposed to be the way of worshiping God. In conclusion, let me then ask a question and say, what about us? We have talked about these good examples from the Bible, the way they were worshiping and the way they convert to Christianity. What about us who are living outside the Bible times? By that I mean, they are people who lived in the first century, during which the Bible was being written. What about us who have lived 2,000 years after that has happened? Where are we? What are we supposed to do? And of course, as individuals, we perhaps need to be asking ourselves a question and say, is our worship the one that is acceptable? Is my worship not the same as Lydia? Is my worship not the same as Paul, Saul of Tarsus? Is my worship not the same of those that we find in Acts chapter 19? How about my worship? Are we worshiping God because Jesus has made a declaration that those who worship him must worship him in truth and in spirit? Is that exactly what we are doing? Or we are the ones perhaps being described in Matthew chapter 15? Jesus actually said, verse 7 to 9, He was talking to the Jews and he said to them, "You hypocrites, well, did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" When we claim and call ourselves worshippers of God, are we not fitting perhaps this description of Jesus in Matthew 15 of those who only proclaim by mouth, yet in the way we do things we are perhaps nominal in everything that we are doing? You know, we have talked several times of nominal Christians that only are known by word. They are known to be Christians simply because of the name Christians, but otherwise there is nothing Christianity in them. There are some who are only Christians on Sunday, but during the week or any other day, you can't see anything pointing to be a Christian in them. How about me? How about you? So we need to be careful, of course, if there is any need for a change, if there is something that I also need to change in my worship, I need to do that. And that needs to be done immediately. The call is, let's do that immediately. Because worship is not about me. Worship is not about you. Worship is about God. Worship is not on our terms, but worship is on God's terms. And I think this is exactly from the examples that we read. The example of Lydia, the example of Saul, the example of those 12 men in Acts chapter 19. We have actually seen that worship is actually according to God's terms, not according to human terms. It doesn't matter how much we may create in our worship. I mean, I shudder at times when I see what actually happens in the world when some movements, big movements, have actually been started by people that are actually being called churches today. And so many people actually follow. And in fact, the leaders of those groups have actually been made into some demigods, some purpose of this world. I shudder when I'm looking at all these people that actually are being hoodwinked by these men. It doesn't matter how many in number people are actually going to fall for such kind of a teaching or worship. It does not make it right simply because it has many people that are following it. Still, Jesus is actually going to say, "I never knew you," to some of you and to some of us. He is still going to say, "I never knew you. Depart from me, because you were workers of lawlessness." And I think that will be a very sad day, a very sad moment perhaps that none of us is actually expecting. We have toiled all our lives. We have done this, we have done that in the name of the Lord, only to be told that "I never knew you, depart from me." I wouldn't want those words to be said to me. Neither would I want them to be said to you. I'm sure I also don't want the same words to be said to you, and you also are supporting me for the words not to be said to me. But this is the trick, for the words not to be said to me or to you. The trick is just to be as simple as the Bible is. The world has complicated the Bible. The world has actually made some mirage of the Bible. But the Bible is just a very simple message that God has given to his people to be understood by his people. So we just need to understand the message, simple as it is, that God is actually putting forth to the people. And this is the worship that Jesus is actually talking about in John chapter 4. Those who worship God should worship him in spirit and in truth. We should worship him in truth because we believe that what he says is true. I don't know how to express this, but like I've said already, it becomes so sad that we actually have so many people, multitudes of people, some who are our dear friends, some who are our dear relatives, some who are very close to us in terms of the earthly relationship, who are easily hoodwinked by these so-called teachers that we know are not teaching the truth. And if you really sit down and you think hard about what the Bible teaches and what is actually going to happen, you remember Jesus actually talks about the gnashing of teeth In Matthew chapter 25, he talks about there shall be gnashing of teeth in that place which some of us are actually going to go, which is hell. And you actually look at us headed to hell, yet we still have an opportunity to change our course and change our direction, because as long as I am still living, and as long as you are still living, you still have an opportunity, and I still have a chance to change the course of my life, such that I can channel my life towards the life of living with Christ forever. Not the life where I am going to be dismissed and told to depart, because Christ never knew me. Some of us are actually going to hear these words echoing in their ears, because we would have just failed to do the basic, which is to know that worship is not on our terms, but worship is on the terms of God. Let us try, if there is anything that we need to change in our lives, in regards to our worship to God, we need to do that with emergency. It's actually an emergency. We need to attend to that, because there is nothing that is more important to a human being on earth except to fear God and, of course, to worship Him and to obey. I beg that I may be able to identify those areas that I need to change. If my worship is not the one that is acceptable, I need to make amends now. If yours is also exactly the same and it needs some corrections here and there, we need to do that, and we need to do it now. Nobody's going to do it for me. Nobody's going to do it for you. Each and every one of us, according to what Jesus said we are going to give account to Him, needs to make a tweaking, in their life. Just make a change now, because it's important to change so that my worship can be accepted by God. Thank you very much for listening to me this morning. I hope and trust that those few words may actually encourage us and, of course, motivate us moving forward as people that claim to be Christians, so that at the end, our worship is not going to be that which is unacceptable, but our worship is going to be that which God is going to accept at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, we need eternal life to live with God, to live with His Son forever and ever and ever again. Thank you so much.